Hello everyone, FPL Raptor here and welcome back to another video on my YouTube channel. For today's video, I went through over 500 of your teams and collected data around the most highly owned assets, and I've built the template 11 so that we can go through it and decide, is it a good template? Should we stick roughly to it? Or are there places that we can maybe differentiate? If you do enjoy today's video, please do smash that like button, and if you are new around here, make sure to subscribe as well. But without further ado, let's jump into it. So guys, as I said, for today's video, I went through over 500 of your teams. It's actually 540 to be exact. I put out a tweet asking for your drafts to be rated, which will actually be tomorrow's video. So if you enjoy those rating your draft videos, make sure to subscribe for that video tomorrow. But I thought, why not? Why waste that, right? You've all sent me your teams. Don't just do a rating your draft, which is where I rate 8 of your drafts. I might as well use all the data. So I decided, and I regret doing this because it took me over 4 hours, to go through and just collect the data from your team. So I had a spreadsheet open. I went on each team one at a time and just marked which players were owned on the spreadsheet. It started to obviously get quicker and quicker. And when I got to around 200 teams, what I decided to do was just remove the players that had only come up a few times and just focus on tallying how often those really popular players come up. So what I've got at the end of the video is the percentage ownership for the 10 most highly owned assets in the goalkeeper, defender, midfield, and forward spot. So if you want to see the exact percentages of how often these players are owned, players like Barco, you'd be very surprised how highly owned they are, then wait until the end of the video because I have all of those percentages. So let's start with the team. By the way, this team is rated at 99% according to Fantasy Football Hub. If you want to get your own team rated, and I highly doubt you beat that, but if you want to get your own team rated and you want to see if you can get close, there is a link down below in the description to get your team rated for free. And once you've done that, if you then want to plan ahead with that team or get access to data, player comparisons, you can do so at the moment for 50% off. So it's as little as £3.25 per month. You can get access to all of the stuff over at Fantasy Football Hub. It is absolutely worth doing for me. I can't imagine fantasy football now without Fantasy Football Hub. So, like I said, 99% rated. And the goalkeeper spot was actually one of the closest. So there were two very standout goalkeepers. And again, we'll see the percentages at the end of the video. And that was Henderson and Flecken. Actually, for a large spell, I was on about 300 teams. And Flecken was a little bit clear of Henderson. And then Henderson started to draw it back. So maybe if I did 1,000 teams, then Flecken might go back in front. But it's definitely between the two of them for the £4.5 million goalkeeper spot. And in all honesty, I like that. I think they are probably, arguably, the best two 4.5s. I think Henderson is the best. There's just still those slight concerns. As I said in yesterday's video, Johnston looks like he could be leaving now, which opens up that number 1 spot for Henderson. But there are rumours circulating that they might go after someone like an Aaron Ramsdale, in which case all of a sudden you wouldn't imagine Ramsdale goes from being Arsenal's number 2 to Palace's number 2. That's just not a move that suits his career. So if he does go, or they sign someone like that, then maybe Henderson's not the best pick. But for the time being, we thought Henderson would start the season anyway, and that's looking more and more likely. So he is probably my favourite 4.5. You've then got Flecken, who I don't think fixtures-wise is as good as a lot of the other goalkeepers, but he's playing for a very good defence. Brentford was 6th last season for expected goals conceded, and he does have a couple of home fixtures, Crystal Palace and Southampton at home in the opening 3 game weeks. So the fixtures aren't there outside of that. They've got some very tricky away games, but I understand it. And if you go for Flecken, you can have Valdemarson as well, who was actually, I think, the most highly owned £4 million goalkeeper. So you've probably got Brentford's number 1 and 2 there. So listen, I think they're great choices. In terms of other keepers that were coming up quite a lot, Raya was quite popular. Actually, a lot more popular than I thought, as a good way to cover the Arsenal defence, because as you can see here, there are no Arsenal defenders, but Raya was quite highly owned. Pickford and Pope and players like that, the £5 million goalkeepers, actually weren't that highly owned. So most people were going for either Henderson, Flecken, or they were going for someone like a David Raya. But these two were definitely the most highly owned. And like I said, I do like it. And to be honest, you could conceivably have the pair of them. The fixtures don't rotate perfectly, but they're also not a bad set of fixture rotations. For example, in game week 3, when Henderson plays against Chelsea, Flecken plays against Southampton at home. So you could conceivably have two £4.5 million goalkeepers, and that's why I've got them here. The defence, I actually like. I love the defence. This is a defence that I would be very happy choosing. You've seen in all of my drafts recently, I've had Trent and I've had Guardiola as the two best premium defenders. More and more so, I am wanting to squeeze an Arsenal defender in, but when I say the Arsenal defence weren't even close to getting into this template squad, They weren't even in the top 5, 6, 7, 8 defenders in terms of ownership percentage. Arsenal were nowhere to be seen. Raya was the closest, obviously, to getting in. But Trent and Gvardiol were very highly owned, and you can understand why. The thing that is great about Trent and Gvardiol in comparison to someone like a Saliba is not only do they have clean sheet potential because they were the second and third best defence for underlying data last season, but they've also got that attacking threat that you don't necessarily have as much with the Arsenal defence. People will point to the fact that White and Gabriel do have attacking threat, and they do have some, but if you look at in terms of the quality and quantity of chances, it's just not as high as Gvardiol and Trent. So you can understand why these two are in the template. And then it came down to the other spot. So unfortunately, the third most highly owned premium defender was actually Pedro Porro, and he was owned by quite a lot of managers. But when you try and build a squad, obviously I can't have every single expensive player, and therefore Porro was sadly the one that had to make way. But I just want to give a shout out to Porro because I love him as an option, and so do you guys as well. When I went through all of your teams, Porro was very, very, very highly owned, and I was surprised about how often he kept coming up over and over again. So if you can squeeze Porro into a team like this and you're happy making a downgrade elsewhere, I do like it. But what we essentially went for then, once you had to drop Porro to squeeze the rest of the players in, was 2 4.5s. And the most popular 2 4.5s, Mykolenko I expected. Playing for an Everton defence that kept so many clean sheets last season, seems to be very popular amongst content creators. I've actually not got Mykolenko in a lot of my teams because I am worried. There are still rumours circulating that he might end up leaving Everton. Also, Everton were only 7th for expected goals conceded last season. Still very decent, but the likes of Crystal Palace, the likes of Brentford and Nottingham Forest were all better defences based on underlying data. So I wonder if we might see a slight drop-off in the amount of clean sheets that Everton get. But regardless, Mykolenko is a great pick because they do keep a lot of clean sheets. Pickford is an excellent goalkeeper, so maybe they will once again overperform their expected data. Tarkowski and Branthwaite are a fantastic pairing in defence, so they are very, very strong. Obviously, no Onana this year for Everton. He's obviously gone to Aston Villa. So let's see how Everton do. I don't mind Mykolenko. The pick that I absolutely love, and I didn't expect so many of you to love as well, is Anthony Robinson. 6 assists last season for Fulham. He's looked very good during pre-season, already got 2 or 3 attacking returns. And the fixtures are also very good. And he rotates extremely nicely with Mykolenko. So I actually really, really like that pair of Mykolenko and Robinson. I've had it in a couple of my drafts. If you want Robinson, but you want another rotation, you could go for someone like a Livramento or a Lewis Hall, but they weren't getting close to us being as highly owned as Mykolenko and Robinson. So that was kind of the 4 more expensive ones. And then Barco was actually hands down comfortably, when you see the percentages at the end, the most owned defender. And it makes sense because if you want a £4 million defender that you can play potentially, you want them to have something about them. I mean, Harwood, Bellis and Fass were relatively highly owned, but they've not got the same level of attacking threat. And Barco, if he continues to start for Brighton, maybe even once Estepinian's back, he's going to make a mockery of his £4 million price tag. So I understand why he's so highly owned, and I have had him in every single draft myself as well. But I was surprised about just how high his ownership was. So that back 5 was pretty much the 5 highest owned defenders. The only one, like I said, was Pedro Porro that I just couldn't quite squeeze in if you wanted to keep this team within the budget. So far, it's a ridiculously strong team, and it just continues to get stronger. So moving on to the midfield, we have a similar situation to what happened with the defence, where this isn't necessarily the 5 most highly owned midfielders, but to get it under 100 million, I've gone for the 3 most highly owned, and then we've had to omit a few players in the middle and gone for a couple of cheaper ones because the forward line is also very expensive. So the 3 most highly owned, I'm just going to give you a bit of a spoiler for the percentages, were Eze, Salah and Nkunku in that order. Eze was owned by 76% of the teams that I looked at, which was very, very high. Salah lower at 74 and then Nkunku at 69. In 4th place was Saka with 31%. So we'll look at the percentages in more detail in the final section. But just to give you an idea about how clear Eze, Salah and Nkunku are, they are all owned by about 3/4 of managers. And then after that, there really isn't a template with the remaining midfielders. So let me know in the comments, are you one of those I'm just going to swear that I can't do that. Are you one of those template people? Do you have Eze, Salah and Nkunku? I will hold my hands up. I have those 3 because I think they're fantastic. And it's not necessarily... We always use the word template like it's a dirty word. You don't want to be template. Template just means they're picked by a lot of managers, right? And normally players are picked by a lot of managers because they are good picks. They're not always picked by a lot of managers because there's a bandwagon or because there's majority influence. Sometimes they are just fantastic and they're priced well. Salah, I think the reason he's in there is he's 2.5 cheaper than Haaland, so a lot of people have him instead of Haaland. But also, because he's not that much more than the likes of Saka, Palmer, Son, you can squeeze him in alongside Haaland, right? Especially with some of the other cheaper options, which we'll see in a second. So I think Salah's a great option. It's understandable why he's so highly owned. I was surprised that Eze was the most highly owned midfielder. And actually, I think he's like the third most highly owned asset in the game, if you're looking at the engaged managers. I do still think 7 million was 0.5 too cheap. I think if Eze was 7.5, I'm not sure it'd be... I reckon he'd only be 10% higher owned than Gordon, rather than, and I'll look at the days now, like 50% higher owned than Gordon. So I think he is probably slightly too cheap, but there are some concerns around how Palace will look. They've looked fantastic under Glasner towards the back end of last season, but Elise was so heavily involved in every attack. Because I know this from an FPL perspective. It was Eze, Elise and Mateta were just combining for every goal. They've obviously signed Kamada as well, but we don't know. There are some unknowns around how Eze will be performing. And obviously he struggled with fitness a little bit last season as well. So I don't think he's like an auto pick, but I certainly understand why he is quite highly owned. And then in Nkunku, I mean, Palmer is nowhere to be seen, not even close to getting in the top 10 most highly owned midfielders. And it's because Nkunku has just looked really good during pre-season. He feels like he is a way to cover the Chelsea attack. So if you get it wrong and Palmer smashes it, you'd expect Nkunku to do fairly well too. And he's £4 million cheaper. So yeah, I kind of do understand why the three of those are so highly owned. But I was just surprised that after that, there wasn't really a template forming. So I've got Rodgers and Winks as the other two. That's just to afford the rest of the team. But in terms of who was more highly owned than them, Saka was, Gordon was, Son was, and Bailey was. So in an ideal world, those four would be in the team instead. Saka, Gordon, Son, Bailey in that order. But Winks and Rodgers weren't much more lowly owned than that. They were at 18 and 17%. Rodgers is in 1 in 5 drafts, basically, Rodgers is in. And I like him as a pick. Do I think he's that good? For 5 million, potentially. But I really like Ahmad and I really like Bob as well. And I do just wonder, at the start of the season, do Ahmad and Bob have slightly higher upside potentially in the attack? That's no disrespect to Rodgers, but given that I expect Man City's attack to be comfortably better than the likes of Aston Villa and United, you'd say Bob is probably the best option. But Ahmad has looked exceptionally strong during pre-season. And on top of that, Ahmad's been taking set pieces. I don't know. I still think Rodgers is fantastic, but I wouldn't say that Rodgers is definitely the best 5 million pick anymore. I think Bob and Ahmad are both decent shouts as well. And you can understand why you would go for someone like Rodgers when it allows you to facilitate. When you look at this squad in its entirety, it's fantastic. I wouldn't want to start Rodgers every week. And for most of you that had him, you weren't. But obviously, just to build this template team, we're essentially starting him every week here, which I'm not a massive fan of. You could bring Robinson in for game week 2 and play a 4 at the back, but then you're playing a 4-3-3, which probably isn't for me. Winks is in there at 4.5. I wouldn't want a 4.5 midfielder. I would find a way. If you're in a 3-4-3, my advice to you, if you're in a 3-4-3, find a way to make that fifth midfielder Ahmad, Bob or Rodgers. It's only an extra 0.5, which can be difficult to find. But to go from Winks to Rodgers, Ahmad or Bob, it could offer you a really nice player that's just going to shoot up in price. Because if any of the three of those get consistent minutes and decent returns, I don't think they'll be like Palmer of last year. They're not going to be that good, but they could shoot up in price. And all of a sudden, you've got some massive price rises. You've got a player that everyone desperately wants to own, and you was in there from the start at 5 million. So no disrespect to Winks. He'll play pretty much every minute for Leicester, but I would want one of those £5 million midfielders instead. So moving on to the forward line, and this was comfortably the template forward line. And if you are interested in kind of the formation, pretty much every manager that I was looking at now was playing a 3-4-3. And it was, for a lot of managers, somewhat flexible in terms of maybe they had 8 attackers that could all play, and at some points it could become a 3-5-2. For example, rather than Winks, they might have had like a 5.5 Andreas or Smith Rowe on the bench, so it could rotate into a 3-5-2. But for the most part, I was just clicking upon team after team after team after team that were in a 3-4-3 with Haaland, Isak, Mane. So this appears to be the template front three at the moment. And it's interesting because only a couple of weeks ago, Wood was so much more popular than Mane's, whereas now he's dropped down quite a bit. I won't ruin the percentages completely because we're going to do that at the end, but Isak was owned by every manager out of 540, apart from I think it was 7 or 8 teams. It was over 99% of teams. So if you want to know who is the template player, the closest after that was Barco at 86%. So Isak is like, by some distance, the most highly owned asset in the game in terms of engaged managers. And the reason that I've gone through all this rather than just looking at the percentages on the website is because I want to look at those engaged managers that are thinking about FPL a lot and planning carefully. And Isak is just literally an auto pick for every single manager apart from 7, who I just guess wanted to be slightly different. So absolutely crazy numbers there. But you can understand why. I've said for a while, there are really no real negatives. To Newcastle looked decent during pre-season. He's on penalties. Wilson doesn't look like he'll be fit to start the season. He looks incredibly fit based on his previous record. We were worried about whether he'll be able to stay fit and stop getting injured. Last season looked fantastic towards the back end. He was sprinting at 90 minutes. Pre-season looks very, very strong as well. So, I mean, Southampton at home in the opening game, you could conceivably captain him if you wanted to. But definitely the popular captain was Salah. Then you've got Haaland. So you can see this is a Haaland and Salah draft, which is why I have Rodgers in there and why I can't squeeze someone like Son or Saka in there, because this is a Haaland and Salah draft, but it's an incredibly strong one. And I can understand why more and more why people are doing this, because if you go for something like this, strong defense, strong midfield bar one spot, strong attack, bench cover. Like, where is this team lacking? Well, I'll tell you in a second, but I understand the thought process. I'm not really sacrificing that much there. So I really do like the Haaland and Salah drafts more and more. People have been saying for a while, Rosh will end up on one. I might do. And I'm not afraid to do that. It's not like I can't go back on what I said. But I do look at it and there are still some things lacking. But in terms of what you get Erling Haaland. He's looked so good during pre-season. He's had a summer of rest. I do worry that he's still struggling with niggles, which Pep calls it, which is he's clearly not fully fit. And his body is made of glass a little bit. We saw that in his previous career at Dortmund as well. He's not someone that just stays injury-free, but for the spells where he is injury-free, or at least fit enough to play, he's unbelievable. And I will need to buy a 30-person sofa in Game Week 2 to hide behind if I don't have Haaland against Ipswich. So, listen, I love it as a pick. I understand it. I think he's as good as, if not slightly better than Salah. I still do believe that picking one rather than both is better for structure, but I also do think there is a lot of merit in just going for both. And then if one of them isn't performing, if Haaland looks like he's struggling, if Salah doesn't look good under slot, well, then you can downgrade them. So I like it more and more, and we'll see what happens, I guess, next week. So those two are in there. And then, like I said, Maniz. So Maniz is owned by 25% more managers than Wood and 27% more than João Pedro. So Maniz is comfortably the most favoured budget forward at the moment amongst engaged managers, which I found really interesting. I guess it is those fixtures. More and more people are realising, hang on a second, United without Euro, without signing a proper CDM, and then Leicester and Ipswich, and West Ham at home after that, they're a pretty nice set of opening fixtures. So I do understand. And also his data last season was really good. Set up at a 0.54 non-penalty expected goal involvement per 90. So he's a really, really nice pick. So there we go. Like I said, this team is rated at 99% according to Fantasy Football Hub. Feel free to get your own team rating down below for free in the comments. Sorry, in the description. So what is this lacking? Why isn't everyone on this draft if this template is so strong? Well, the first thing is, if you go for this exact structure, you are relying on a £5 million mid and you've not really got anyone to rotate them out for. What I would probably suggest, if you were going to go for this exact thing, is you downgrade one of Flecken or Henderson and you do Rodgers to someone like Hudson-Odoi, who was very close to making this team. Semenyo, Andreas, Smith-Rowe, Murphy, the list goes on and on. I probably forgot someone very important there. The £5.5 million mids are actually very strong options for me. So if this was my team and I was going to go with exactly this setup, Flecken to a 4 and Rodgers up would make me feel a little bit safer. Or you could just start with someone like Oscar, Bob or Ahmad, who has better fixtures over the opening 2, and potentially after that think, well, I might have to make 2 transfers to upgrade that spot if I need to. So you could still go aggressive like this. I would just want a slightly better 11th player in my team. Where else is this lacking? I think the only other place that I'm like, this is an issue, is there are no Arsenal. And there are places to get Arsenal. You could go for an Arsenal defender instead of Gvardiol or Trent quite comfortably, but then you don't have one of Gvardiol or Trent. You could go for an Arsenal attacker, but the only one is maybe Havertz in there, but you're still going to have to downgrade a hell of a lot and probably lose one of your premium defenders again. So I don't think there's an obvious and easy place to get an Arsenal player in here. And I think the only places where you could, it would really detriment the rest of the team. So that's a concern for me. And so if we move on to, before we look at the percentages, where can you beat the template? Because the template is strong pretty much every year. I think, was it last year or the year before? I think it might have been last year with the Bruno and Rashford start. Last year, the template had a stinker at the start of the season, but then it picked up. So the template i.e. the players that are owned by a lot of managers, it is usually quite difficult to beat. I think it's Arsenal. I think when I look at this, where can I beat those that are so focused on having Haaland and Salah and looking at the fixtures? Triple Arsenal. Have Raya, have Saka, have Havertz. All of a sudden, you've got three very differential players in there. It does mean that you'd probably have to choose one of Salah or Haaland or go really cheap elsewhere. The other position, I think, is probably Son and then Palmer as well as Saka. So there's no premium midfielder outside of Salah here. So if you can have one or two of Son, Saka and Palmer in here, again, you're differentiating there. And maybe some of the other £6.5 million midfielders like Bailey, like Gibbs-White, I think could be a really nice shout. So I don't look at this as unbeatable. I don't look at this template and go, this is a bit of an issue because there's no way that this doesn't get outperformed by more differential managers. So it doesn't worry me too much. But on the flip side, I looked at this and I was like, actually, that is a very strong team. So let me know down below what you think of the template team, but don't click off yet because now we're going to take a look at the most highly owned assets in each of the 4 positions and discuss whether they should be that highly owned or not. So guys, here are the final numbers, and apologies for being almost off the screen. I'm just trying to get all the data on the screen without covering it. So this is, like I said, the data from over 500 FPL teams. It is the 10 most highly owned assets in each of the positions with ownership percentage rounded to the nearest whole number. And if you do appreciate the effort that went into this, please do smash that like button. And if you are new around here, or you've just not subscribed before, please do consider subscribing. I would really appreciate it. I'm trying to hit 125,000 subscribers before game week 1. So we have just over 4,000 left to do. I think we can do it, but I obviously need your help to do it. So thank you very much. And now let's take a look at the percentages. For the goalkeepers, Henderson and Flecken, as I said, are the 2 most highly owned by a fair distance when you consider that 3rd and 4th are £4 million goalkeepers. So Henderson just taking it at the moment, but these appear to be the most popular too. I would agree that if the situation around Crystal Palace seems pretty clear by game week 1, I'll probably go for Henderson, but I do like Flecken as well. In terms of the 4 million goalkeepers, you can see Valdemarsson was the most popular, often paired with Flecken, which makes sense. And then after that, Fabianski. So I kind of agree with all of that. Raya, despite being the 5th most highly owned goalkeeper, still only down at 13%. And as you can see on the defenders list, there are no Arsenal defenders in the top 10. So Arsenal defence is not being covered. If you want your way to differentiate, that is it. You've then got Miguel with 12%. Miguel's not going to start. It looks like it will be Sells. So get rid of Miguel if you've got him and put Sells in instead. And I would say I am still slightly tempted. Sells has played pretty much every preseason game. He started their most recent one before the Premier League. I don't think they've got any more preseason games now, Forest. And Sells started once again. And I don't think Miguel was in the squad. So I'm now starting to think, could I just go with Sells? He looks like he's going to be the starting goalkeeper for Forest. Maybe I'll take the risk because I've always wanted a Forest goalkeeper since the start of pre-season. So I'm now thinking more and more so that Sells might be the one to go for. You can then see Pickford with 8%, Bentley, Virginia, 2 more forwards with 7 and 6, and then Pope with 6%. So it's definitely Henderson, Flecken, and then a few Ryers and maybe a few Nottingham Forest goalkeepers as well. Moving on to the defenders, as I said, Barco, 86% was comfortably the most highly owned defender. But after that, it was Gvardiol, Trent, Porro were owned by a lot of managers. I couldn't squeeze Porro into the team. The highlighted players are the ones that were actually in the template 15 that I was able to squeeze in to 100 million. So Porro's definitely the one missing out there. So potentially you could drop one of Gvardiol or maybe even Trent. To afford this team, give you an extra 1.5 million, do Trent to Porro instead. I don't mind it. He seems to be really, really popular. And I can understand why, absolutely. And then, like I said, Robinson and Mikalenko, the 2 most popular £4.5 million defenders, which was a little bit of a surprise to me. I did not expect Robinson to be 39% owned. That shocked me. Munoz very close to making it into the team with 27% ownership at 5 million. So Munoz is becoming more and more popular, I should say, despite him being only at 4% ownership amongst the entire database. And then we've got Harwood Bellis as the 2nd most popular 4. If you want to go for 2, I would say he's arguably the 2nd best. And then we've got Konsa and Anderson, still relatively popular, but not quite as popular as Robinson and Mikalenko. So the defenders there, lots of highly owned defenders. But then after Anderson, it does start to tail off a little bit. I think the most highly owned Arsenal defender was Saliba in 9% of teams. There you go. Like I said, Raya at 13%, Saliba, it was either at 8 or 9%. I would be very, very tempted if I was trying to differentiate to have an Arsenal defender in there. For the midfielders, as I spoke about with the team, there were 3 that were very clear, which is Eze, Salah, and Nkunku. All of them around 70% or above. So if you're trying to beat the template again, those are the 3 to maybe look to avoid. And then after that, there's a massive drop-off. But we have Saka in 31%. So Saka is still relatively highly owned. And I think if you go for Haaland and Salah, there's no Saka in there unless you're completely disregarding some of the other spots in your team and going for a very weak defence. Gordon up at 27%. He is creeping into more and more teams the closer we get to the deadline. I love him as a pick. Only 7.5. Only 0.5 more than Eze. Is he better than Eze? Maybe not, but I definitely think it's close. You could go there if you wanted to. Son in a quarter of teams, always a good pick, but we'll discuss in a second with the player just behind my chair that way. Solanke could be joining Spurs, so that's a slight risk there. And then Bailey. I think Bailey might be my favourite 6.5 after Nkunku now, and you guys agree in 20% of teams. Obviously, Winks and Rodgers were in the team just to make it affordable, and then we've got Gibbs-White at 16%. Just after Gibbs-White was actually Hudson-Odoi. So if you're wondering who was the most popular 5.5, wasn't Andreas, wasn't Smith-Rowe, it was Hudson-Odoi. So if you want to follow the template, by all means go for it. Hudson-Odoi was very popular. Moving on to the forwards, 99% Isak. Like I said, I think there was 7 out of over 500 teams, or 8, that didn't have Alexander Isak. So it was ridiculous. I mean, it was virtually 100%. It's crazy numbers. So yeah, I would probably consider having Alexander Isak in your team. Haaland at 71%. That scares me so much considering he's not in my latest draft. But yeah, he's creeping up there now. He's only 3% less than Salah. But as you can see, if 74% of managers have Salah and 71% have Haaland, Salah and Haaland drafts are comfortably the most popular at the moment. And this is what we expected the closer we get towards the Game Week 1 deadline. Muniz, 37%. Again, I did not expect that to be so high, but it is. Watkins only just below at 27%, but I just couldn't squeeze him into the team. Obviously, at 9 million, if you want Haaland and Salah and Isak and Eze and Trent and Gvardiol, there's no way to get Watkins in as well. But lots of managers still think Watkins is decent, but a quarter of that's still a very low number considering how good he was last season. Havertz at 13%. Not particularly high, but you can understand why that might creep up soon. I mean, Raya, Saka and Havertz being the most highly owned, but at 13, 31 and 13. Arsenal being disrespected, let me tell you that. And I am one of them because I only have Saka at the moment. But I'm increasingly thinking, can I get Raya in there as well? I'd quite like to start the season with an Arsenal defender and Saka. And I do think that Raya is a decent way to cover the Arsenal defence because he's cheaper than Saliba and Gabriel, but also because of the doubts that are surrounding a lot of the 4.5 goalkeepers. It feels like it's a perfect storm for just maybe starting the season with David Raya. So yeah, very lowly owned Arsenal assets. Wood and João Pedro and Armstrong, 3 very good budget forwards, but obviously a lot more lowly owned than Muniz at the moment. Jebison was the most popular 4.5 forward. And then Solanke, if I just turn my chair a little bit, 5%. I assume that's either managers not seeing the Spurs rumours or putting him in because of the Spurs rumours and just thinking a 7.5 forward at Spurs maybe on pens would be great. I would want confirmation that he's on pens. I think he would take them, but could Son keep them? Maybe. So I almost feel like that would be important for me because he's so good in the past. I know Bournemouth don't really get many penalties, but he's good because he has that potential. So I think Solanke would be worth the money if he goes to Spurs, but yeah, for the time being, I don't know that at the time of me recording. So those are the percentages. Let me know down below. Are these any of these that surprise you massively? Are there any that you would have expected to be on here that aren't? And out of the 15 template that I just showed you, how many are in your team? And if there's more than 12, well then I'm not even going to comment on it, but hopefully there's no more than 12 in your team. So guys, I just wanted to quickly update you on my role as the football manager for South London United as part of the One Future Football Global Virtual Football League. And if you've got no idea what I'm talking about, I will link down below a more in-depth discussion and explanation around what my role is and what this entails and how you can support me. But I just wanted to say we did make the playoffs. So I'll flash up on your screen right now the table. We finished in 3rd and the top 6 make the playoffs. So we're in a playoff position. We're in the quarterfinals against Niger United, who are a Nigerian team. And it's going to be played across 2 legs. The first leg is on Friday at 8 p.m. The second leg is Sunday at 7 p.m. just to get that right. And those are obviously UK time. So please do support. This is the team on the screen that we're going to be going into the first leg against. And I wanted to just show you how you can kind of support and watch the games and become a fan. So the first thing, if I just skip over to the YouTube channel for One Future Football, is how you can actually watch the games. I don't think some people realise you can watch like a simulation of the games that you can get an understanding about how the team's playing. So this is how they look. This was our most recent game. So I'll just click on this as an example. Obviously, here's the intro. But if I skip to the middle of it, you can see it. I mean, we didn't do particularly well in the last game at the start of it, but you can see a simulation of the game and it will tick along and players will take shots. You'll have the XG on the left-hand side. You can obviously jump in the chat as well. On the right-hand side, you can't see here. I'm in the chat for every game that we're a part of. So yeah, come and watch the games at the times that are obviously listed and get involved. But if you want to support the club as well, beyond just obviously watching the game this Friday and this Sunday, you can do. So if I just skip over now to One Future Football, when you load in on One Future Football, it'll ask you to sign up. It's completely free, by the way. Doesn't cost anything. I'm not asking you to pay for anything. Just sign up and become a fan. Once you do that, if you click on your dashboard, so top right corner, click on your dashboard, it will come up on this screen and it'll ask you where mine says South London United. It'll ask you to select a club. All you need to do is select South London United and you become a fan of my team that I'm managing. And it would really help me. And I appreciate the support as well. I'm going to check in. And what check-in allows you to do is it gives you more club credits. And the more club credits you get, the more control you can have over the club in the future. So yeah, I'll leave it there. But wish us luck, at the very least, wish us luck ahead of the quarterfinals because it's a big couple of legs. And if we make that into the semis, considering we finished bottom of the league last year, I'll absolutely take this. And fingers crossed we can have a really successful playoffs. So guys, there we have it. That is the data collected from over 500 of your teams to build the most template team at the moment. And then to analyze that, discuss where we could differentiate and show you the overall percentages as well. If you appreciate the effort that went into today's video, please do smash that like button. And if you've got to this point and you're not yet subscribed, please do consider doing so. And as I said at the start of the video, make sure to check out Fantasy Football Hub if you want to get your team rated for free or get 50% off. Both of those links will be in the description. But until next time, thank you very much. Bye-bye.